My name is Michael Gately. I'm Executive Director of BIO, Biographers International Organization, which aims to promote the art and craft of biography, cultivate a diverse community of biographers, encourage public interest in biography, and provide educational and fellowship opportunities that support the work of biographers worldwide. It's great to see so many BIO members, and if you're not yet a member of BIO, please join us. You'll find a link to our website, biographersinternational.org, in the chat. During today's event, please write questions in the chat box, and we'll save time for them near the end of the conversation. It's my pleasure now to turn to Linda Leavell, BIO President. Linda?
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody to this great event. I am, as Michael said, the president of BIO. I'm ending my second term, and I'm running for a second term. So this isn't a campaign speech, though. So we're very, and I want to thank a few people. A committee led by Ann Boyd-Rue, who should be with us tonight, is responsible for starting this series of Zoom workshops that we started last summer when after we had to cancel the conference due to the pandemic. And they've been very, very well attended and very exciting. This is the first workshop where we've interviewed a single well-known biographer, and rather than a panel of biographers. And so I'm very excited to welcome Candice Millard. Those of you who have been members for a long time in BIO will, well, not that long, but will remember that Candice won the BIO Award in 2018, I believe it was. Is that right, Candice? Yes, and that's when we met in Boston that year. And this, happened to be on the committee that selected Candice for this award. And it's an award that goes for somebody who's made an outstanding contribution to biography in some way. And our committee felt that Candice's particular form of biography, which we called a slice of life biography, that she had perfected this form, and it was a wonderful example to the rest of us. And I don't know any other biographer who uses this form the way that she does, although that, or at least hasn't made it their motif in the way that Candice does. So I know from the questions, we asked for questions from people in advance, and I know many of those wrote it to me in superlatives, praising the work of Candice Millard. One person said she's my favorite author. Another person said that who was teaching history at a community college in Virginia. Well, Mark Leapson, some of you know, Mark's probably here, said that he thought Destiny of the Republic was the best historical book of 19th century America that he'd ever read.
Wow.
So, people are we're just in awe of you, Candice, in the way that you take a craft that we're all very familiar with and make it come alive. So as most of you know, she is the author of 3 books, which I happen to have with me here. The first one that she wrote was in 2005, River of Doubt, which is the story of Teddy Roosevelt's venture down the Amazon soon after he left his the second term of his presidency. It's quite the adventure book, a wonderful read if you haven't read it. Her second book is the one I mentioned, Destiny of the Republic, and I've just had the pleasure of finishing this yesterday. It's been a great fun to read it. This is about the assassination of James Garfield, a president who I knew very little about and came to admire greatly in the course of reading this book. And then her third book, which happens to be the first one that I read, is Hero of the Empire, which is about Winston Churchill during the Boer War when he was a very, very young man. And I thought Candice did a terrific job of showing his leadership potential and his particular character in those early years. And it also is a great adventure. So congratulations to Candice on those books. And I also want to mention Steve Paul, who is a member of the board of directors, and Steve Paul and Kansas are fellow residents of Kansas City and have known each other, I think, for some time since Steve wrote an article about Candice in her first book. So Steve was instrumental in getting Candice to join us today. So thank you. Thank you, Steve. Okay, let's see. I think without further ado, I will launch into the questions. And I also want to say that I heard from about a dozen people over the past week or two sending me questions. Some of the questions I received were similar to ones that I had planned to ask anyway, and are incorporated in my interview. And then some of them I will ask afterwards. And then after that, we will look for questions in the chat. Okay, so how do you choose your subjects? And this is wording from one of the questions I received. Do you stumble across them, or do you have a method of looking for them?
Well, first of all, just let me say thank you so much, Linda, for that introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to BIO for inviting me, and for that great honor of receiving the BIO Award a few years ago. It was a thrill for me, so thank you so much. Choosing my subjects, it's kind of a combination. It really varies with each one. I mean, like all of you, I'm sure, I read everything I can. I have a lot of ideas that will never see the light of day and never should see the light of day. I've got a ton of file folders over there filled with ideas. I've got way too many books of things that I thought I might write about and never did, or maybe even spent a lot of time working on and never ended up actually even writing a proposal because I figured out finally that it wouldn't work, heartbreakingly sometimes. So it just depends. So for instance, my first book, The River of God, I was living in Washington, D.C. I was working at National Geographic magazine, and I gotten married. My husband was living in Kansas City, had a business in Kansas City, and I thought, we should probably live together at some point, just to be traditional. But it broke my heart to leave National Geographic because I loved it. I loved working there. It was a job that I had dreamed of for many years, and while I was there, it's really there where I developed my love of biography. I was kind of their point person for finding stories about people. We had a lot of stories about animals and rivers and societies, but very few about just people or events of history as well. So I really just fell in love with that. And when I realized I was going to have to leave and move to Kansas City, I just started looking for ideas because I thought if I could write a book, I could live anywhere and do something that I love even more. And I was having lunch with a friend who named James Chase, who you may know of his work. He wrote what I consider to be the definitive biography of, it's just escaping me. Sorry, his name is escaping me. But anyway, he was a biographer as well. And I was having lunch with him, and he was writing about the election of 1912. And he said, have you ever heard about this trip that Roosevelt took down an unmapped river in the Amazon? And even though I was interested in Theodore Roosevelt, as many people are, and I had read biographies about him, I had just kind of read over that part of his life because it was very, very small. It was after his active political career, and very little attention was paid to it. And so I went back to work and I started doing some research just out of curiosity. And I was just like, this is an amazing story. You've got murder, and you have, Roosevelt nearly taking his own life, and you have the Amazon. And it was sort of everything I've been working at for the past 6 years at National Geographic, all the natural history and the science. And deep research all kind of came together. And so it was really a gift to me because it sold very quickly, and it really had very little to do with me. I was unknown completely, but it was this amazing story, and it was Theodore Roosevelt. And so that was just kind of serendipity. And then Garfield, that again was just kind of, I knew I wanted another story that had a lot of science in it, because I had loved that aspect, doing the research and writing in River of Doubt. And so I was actually researching Alexander Graham Bell, just general research, just kind of throwing a very wide net, seeing what came up. And I just read something about Garfield, about Bell trying to help save Garfield's life after Garfield was shot. And like most Americans, the only thing I knew about Garfield was that he had been assassinated. And so I started doing research. And again, you know, it's kind of my favorite part of this whole process is when you're doing some research and you're like, holy smokes, this is incredible, you know? And so I was like, James Garfield was amazing. You know, he was brilliant and he was kind and he was brave and he would have been one of our great presidents, I truly believe, had he not been assassinated. And oh, by the way, it really wasn't his assassin who killed him, it was his doctor. So I just kind of fell in love with the story. I fell in love with him. And I remember writing my proposal and sending it to my editor and him saying, oh, Garfield, you want to write about James Garfield? Okay. I think they just assumed I'd do like another adventure or something, and it was completely different. But you know, God bless him, he took a chance on it and he's like, okay, let's see what, you know, happens. And it really felt like a real honor to work on that book. And then Hero of the Empire was actually a story, just the fact that Churchill had been taken as a prisoner of war and escaped. I had heard many years earlier from the person who's now my husband. So he was a journalist for the New York Times for years, and he started his career in South Africa, interviewing the ANC in the 80s when no one was really paying attention to them. He was one of the first to actually go to South Africa and interview them and bring the story home. And so I remember years ago, so this would be like early 90s, him telling me, hey, did you know that Winston Churchill was taken as a prisoner of war and escaped? And I just always stayed in the back of my head. I thought, that's insane. I had no idea that happened. And so after I turned in my manuscript for Garfield, I was just having a conversation with my husband, and he said, do you have any other ideas? And I said, you know, I've always thought about this story about Churchill. And he was like, that is a great idea. And again, there's always this moment at which you're doing research and you think, okay, this has some possibility. But so you need, for the kind of writing I do, you need the kind of tighter, more personal, just really focused story, but also you need it to be on a wider canvas. So like, why should people care? What place does this have in history? And for this story, it was the Boer War, which again, it's kind of like Garfield, like nobody knows anything about the Boer War, but it's really the beginning of modern warfare in so many ways. You know, first concentration camps, guerrilla fighting. So everything, you know, the first time they didn't wear their red coats. I mean, it completely changes everything and prepares them for World War I. And so it was a huge canvas. And obviously the launching of Winston Churchill, this was started his political career. So again, it's just kind of, I'm reading, I'm always looking for ideas, but I'm very, very, very careful about what I end up doing. So what I choose. So to me, that's the most important part of the process is the idea.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
This is a question I've discussed with fellow biographers before. When you first start researching a topic, do you start with the published histories and existing biographies, and then as you move forward, go to the archives, or do you ever just go straight to the archives to see what's there?
It's kind of a jumble. I mean, I think obviously you have to read the secondary sources. I mean, would be crazy, and it would be disrespectful to not just see what everybody else has said. And they also give you ideas like, oh, I didn't even know this archive existed. And so you need to know what's out there. You need to understand, because it's building, it's foundational. It's like any kind of history or anything, you know, we're all learning from each other and building from each other. So I absolutely do read secondary sources. But my favorite part is doing the research, doing the archival research. And also, I've been really lucky that I actually get to go to these places too, where these stories played out. And it's not something that I think you absolutely have to do, but if you can, if you have the time and the resources, I think, at least for me, it lends so much to the storytelling, even if it never ends up in the book. So I spent a ton of time in archives. So first of all, just because I love it, I'm a library person. I've always been a library person, and it's just so fun. And you feel like a detective, you know, and it's just like you're on a treasure hunt, and you never know what you're going to find. But go ahead.
Do you generally finish your research before you start writing?
I finish most of it. So I would say it's usually about 5-year process for me per book. And so I would say I spend at least the first 2 years doing research and just gathering research. And then I spend another year just organizing it all. You know, you come back and you have tons and tons and tons of material that you have to not only read and annotate, but also, to me, I organize it. So I spend a lot of time dividing things, and I'm very old school. You know, I don't use any kind of software or anything. You know, I just use Microsoft Word, and I literally type in, like, okay, so I'm going to have, say, for instance, with Churchill, I have several different Word files on Churchill himself, about his childhood, about his parents, about, you know, his love of war, about his personality, his arrogance. So in each of those, every time I'll read something, like, say I'm reading a letter and somebody's saying, oh, you know, Churchill, he's going to be prime minister one day, but I can't stand that guy. Okay, so I'm going to put it here, and then I'm going to put, again, it's very old school, but I'll type it in, and then I put in parentheses where the source is, like where I can find it. If it's in a book, or it's a letter, if it's in one of my files, what file? Because again, this is a process that goes on for years. So the worst thing, and it has happened to me before, is that I get to where I'm writing and I'll be like, I know I have this great fact or this great quote. Where did I see it? Where among all this material after all these years, where was it? So I always tell my kids, you're going to thank your past self. So like, I'll tell them, if you study, you'll say, you know, thank you, past me, for studying. So I would say, thank you, past Candice, for telling me where this information was, or I would forget it. So, and then I write an outline. So again, this whole process, the organizing, the outline, it takes at least a year. So I really spend a lot of time on the outline, figuring out how I'm going to tell the story. During that time, I always realize I need more research. You know, there's something that I didn't think was important, and now I realize is, or something I thought I had enough information about and I really didn't. For instance, when I was writing Destiny of the Republic, I got to the point where I was going to write about Bell's induction balance. And I realized, like, I need more information about it. Like, what kind of wood did he use? What were the dimensions? That kind of stuff. So I called the Smithsonian, the Museum of American History, and where they have his induction balance. And I know they have in what I call the assassination alcove, this little area, you know, and it's in there on display. So I called them and I said, you know, can somebody there kind of take me through just the specifics about it? And they said, which one? And I said, what do you mean, which one? And they said, well, we have all of the different machines that Bell made when he was trying to figure this out. You know, if you think about it, like, the world's watching, the president's dying, he doesn't know if this is going to work, and he's an inventor, right? And he's trying different. So, like, of course, there are many different prototypes. And they had them all. He had donated them all, and nobody had looked at them all this time since 1881. And so they were in the basement of the museum. And so I said, I'm coming back. So I flew back to Washington and I went to the basement, and they brought this box of all these induction balances. And it's just one of these things that why it's so fun doing this work and this research, because you hold it and you think, oh, I can feel his mind racing and his heart pounding as he's trying to save the president's life. And it was just extraordinary.
Well, for those who haven't read Destiny of the Republic, will you briefly tell them what an induction balance is?
Yeah, so Garfield was shot, and miraculously this bullet went through his back. It didn't hit any vital organs, and it didn't hit his spinal cord, and it just embedded there. But they thought that he was going to die, and because they didn't know. So this is 16 years before the invention of the medical X-ray. So Bell, a scientist, he remembered that he had invented something called an induction balance to try to cancel out the static that telegraph lines were causing in telephone lines. And he realized it actually worked. It was really the first metal conductor. And he realized if he could run it over the president's back, it would make a telltale sign or sound telling him where the bullet was. So that's what the induction balance was.
Yeah, a sort of predecessor to, it wasn't like an X-ray, but a kind of predecessor.
Yeah, I mean, they used it. I mean, it absolutely worked, and it worked. I mean, they used it in the Russo-Japanese War. They used it for many years after that, saved many lives.
Yeah, great. Thanks. That's a great story. Speaking of organization, if you want to tell us more about what you're doing during that year in which you're organizing things, that would be great. But I think a lot about organization myself, and I was struck in two of your books, River of Doubt and in Hero of the Empire. You have quite a cast of secondary characters in addition to your main person. And you do a great job of making these secondary characters come alive and making us know and understand them too. But in the two books I mentioned, you introduce these as they enter the story in some way. But in Destiny of the Republic, you take a sort of novel approach to your organization, and you actually start, I think, with the assassin, and you take us into his world and show us who he is, and then you also introduce us to Garfield as a family man, and then you introduce us to Alexander Graham Bell, and there's no tie-in yet that we know of between these. And then as you tell their individual stories, gradually their story comes together in big climactic moments. So can you tell us about your decision-making process during all of that, of choosing that structure of organization?
Yes, I gave that a lot of thought. My main concern about Garfield is that because people didn't know anything about him, they thought there really wasn't anything interesting to know. And I thought that, again, because if they know anything, they knew that he had been assassinated. It would be wrong to start with assassination, even though it seems like this dramatic moment and might pull people in. I thought it's going to be hard to care that he's assassinated, other than just, oh, that's a shame, unless you know him. And I knew by that point, he's this extraordinary man, and it was a tremendous tragedy, a tremendous loss to our nation. And so I wanted people to understand who he was before we got to the assassination. And so you cared about him, you valued him, you wanted him to live. And then at the same time, it was a gift with Guiteau, his assassin, because I knew so much about him, because he was mentally ill, but his particular brand of madness was delusion, and he believed himself to be someone great, or had the potential to be someone great. And so he had written his memoirs, and after the assassination, he gave every interview that he could. And then when he went on trial, since it was one of the very early insanity defenses, the defense was very, very careful. They did not want him to get off, because the country was enraged and wanted to see him not just found guilty, but hanged. And so they carefully went through his whole life and his whole history. And and he talked about what he was thinking. So I was in his mind. I knew what was going on. So I had all of this great information. So what I wanted to build was this sense of dread, this sense of oncoming tragedy that the reader sees, but Garfield does not. So you're in Garfield's life and his happy family and all of these things that are happening, and this brilliant, kind, decent human being. And at the same time, here comes this madman, and it's this tragedy that's unfolding, and he doesn't know. And the reader, what I hoped you would feel the sense of, for God's sake, turn around, somebody do something, somebody stop him. And so that's what I was trying to build with. And then with Bell, when the book first came out, sometimes people would say, why is Alexander Graham Bell in this book? But as I said, I started with him, and I thought that as I realized, actually, this is going to be about Garfield and Garfield's assassination, but it was really important because it showed what Garfield meant to the country. I mean, Alexander Graham Bell, he's young, he's famous, he finally has some money, has a million ideas of things, and he drops absolutely everything to try to help, and he risks his own reputation to try to help the president. Why? And so that's why I was sort of weaving this in as well. And obviously his story is fascinating too. And so it's a balance, and it's one of these decisions you make as a writer or an editor, helps you and gives you advice about, because it can be too much of a distraction. You can definitely go on a tangent and the reader is confused or frustrated. So you just have to always be sort of reassessing, is this working?
Yeah, great stories. One of the things that I really admire and attempt to emulate in your writing is how you create scenes, because unlike fiction writers, we can't just make up the way the place smells, or we can't say the robins were singing if we don't know there were robins there, and that sort of thing. Right. So I've asked you to pick out a scene, and you chose one in Hero of the Empire towards the end of the book. It's on page 244, everybody, to 250, in case you want to look it up later. And Candice, would you just briefly set up what this scene is and take us through as specifically as you can, and tell us how you went about creating this very dramatic scene?
Right. So just before I do that, just to address a little bit what you were saying about getting all those details that you hope bring a story to life, and that a fiction writer can sort of do with abandon, some, within reason, but we have a lot of restrictions on us as nonfiction writers. And you and I were talking about how it's important to just, again, cast a very wide net, get every conceivable resource that you can, or a primary source material. And I was saying that, for instance, Churchill, so he goes to South Africa. He's actually a journalist at that time. He's going to cover the Boer War, but he has this idea that it's going to make him famous, and that's going to help launch his political career. He was always thinking about that. And so he ends up, he's with this group of soldiers. He's in this town called Escourt, and he writes about it, and some of the known characters also wrote about it. So I had their resources, but then I was just searching around, and I found this diary that one of the soldiers, completely lost to history, who was there at the same time as Churchill in the same place, right before he is taken as a prisoner of war, right before he's captured, is there. And this soldier's grandson happened to find this diary that he wrote in his attic, years later and just decided on his own to self-publish it. So I was able to get a copy of it, and it's so great because it says things like, it talks about the eucalyptus trees that were nearby, so I know what it smells like. It smells like eucalyptus there. It talks about this little mess tent and the kind of food that they ate. It talks about how they bathed, that they had this little canvas tent. So it's all these little details that maybe Churchill would not bother with, right? Certainly in his published writings, he wouldn't bother with. And maybe I couldn't find, but now I can describe those things, and you really get a sense like, okay, this is what life was like for him and for the other men at that time. So anyway, so he's kidnapped, he's taken to a POW camp in Pretoria, and he escapes. Being young Winston Churchill, he's actually has his 25th birthday in this POW camp, and he escapes. And he has to make it across hundreds of miles, almost 300 miles of enemy territory by himself. He doesn't have a map. He doesn't have a weapon. He doesn't have food. He doesn't speak the language. I mean, he has just like nothing. And so he jumps in and off the trains, and he's hiding, and the Boers are furious because not only did he escape, but he's famous because his father had been Chancellor of the Exchequer. They knew Randolph Churchill, and they were very proud to have captured his son. So they're humiliated, they're angry, they're searching everywhere for him. And if they find him, they will very likely kill him. So he's hiding out, and one night he's desperate, and he sees this light, and he thinks maybe it's a small village with, the Africans were pulled into this. Maybe someone can help me. He had a little bit of money. He's like, maybe I can get them to, give me a horse or something. But he goes up and he realizes, this is a coal mine. And so there's a house, and he makes this decision to knock on the door. And so if you read books about Churchill, again, the difference between doing a slice of life and doing a cradle to grave biography, and let me be clear, I love full biographies. I read so many of them, and I have so much respect for it. It's a really, really hard thing to do. But the nice thing about slice of life is you can really dig in, and you can really blow up a scene. So if you're writing about his entire life, especially if it's a single volume, you've got to kind of keep moving, right? There's too much. But with the slice of life, this is like one of the central moments of this book. So you can tell it in a paragraph, he knocked on the door, the guy came to the door, and he's like, oh yeah, I'll help you. But there's so much more, and there's so much tension, and that's what you want. This one of the things, like all of us, when we're reading any kind of book, if you're going to turn the page, it's got to be like some cliffhanger, like you want to know, you're tired, you've got to go to work in the morning, but you're going to turn that page because you need to know. So what I did, I knew from the moment I had read Churchill's account and I had read this guy's account of what happened that night, I knew I'm going to stop at the end. I'm going to end a chapter with this guy. So he knocks on the door, this guy comes out, and Churchill has this lie, right? He's like, okay, I'm going to tell him that I'm a Boer and that I fell off this train. I was joking with my friends and I got hurt. And he actually did have an injured shoulder from a previous incident. And can he help me? And so as soon as the guy comes up and says, and Dutch and Afrikaans starts talking to him, he realized, like, I don't speak Afrikaans. I can't pull this off. There's nothing I can do. And so this guy takes him into the house. It's dark. He takes him into this room, and Churchill just comes clean. He just tells him, look, I'm Winston Churchill, this is happening. And the guy looks at him, turns around, and locks the door. And that's where I ended the chapter, because you think, what's he going to do? Is he going to hand him over to the Boers? What's this guy going to do? And so it helps. Again, this is this like God-given opportunity to keep the tension going and keep the story going. And then when you start the next chapter and you realize, okay, oh my God, he's going to help him. And then your question is why? So I keep, and it's not really intentional. It's just the way I write. I think that to some extent, our writing is how we write, you know, and you can't, I remember people asking me when I wrote about Churchill, how can American woman write, how can you, it was like, I can only tell the story the way I can tell the story. I am who I am. I just do my best. I hope people like it, but this is the story I have to tell, and this is how I can tell it. So what I do, just naturally, I have pretty quick, pretty short chapters. Or short paragraphs, short chapters. And then within each section, each chapter, I kind of have sections. So not even just cliffhangers at the end of a chapter, but each section kind of lands on something, you know, something strong, I hope. Not always, but that's what I'm hoping for. And so, but it also gives you a chance to then explain, right? Okay, so, all right, so you're back in this room and this guy's going to help Churchill. And okay, I'm going to stop for a second and I'm going to say, okay, why? Why is this guy helping him? Why is he even there? What's going on? So I can stop and I can talk about the situation a little bit, maybe for a page and a half or something, and then you get right back into the story. So there's a lot of pacing going on, an effort to keep some kind of pacing.
Do you do that in the first draft, or is this something you come back to?
I do a lot of it in the outlines, and that's why I know, for instance, I know a lot of fiction writers don't outline, and I know I read a ton of fiction. I love fiction, and I've gone to talks by novelists I really admire, and a lot of them say outlining kills the story. I could never, ever outline. I just have to let it take me where it takes me. But the kind of writing I do and the kind of writer I am, I absolutely have to outline. I have to know how I'm going to lay out the story, how I'm going to tell the story. Now, once I start writing, sometimes it changes. I'll think, oh, actually, this is better here. Obviously, I move things around. It's not set in stone. But by the time I start writing, I pretty much know how I'm going to tell the story. And again, I spend a lot of time on it. And it makes it a lot easier to write once I'm done with it. But it also just gives me a chance that, okay, I don't have to worry about that so much anymore. I know how I'm going to tell the story. I can do foreshadowing and stuff because it's easy to move around. It's not easy to move paragraphs and things around a lot because you get lost, right? You get lost in it. And I've been there many times where you're just like, I can't see the story because I'm in all these details, right? But if you basically know how you're going to tell the story, once you start writing, then you can think about things like word choice and hopefully making it kind of lyrical or something. You can worry about the writing without worrying about the structure. That's already set, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay. One other question about how you organize things in a slice of life, because you can read Hero of the Empire and you know who Winston Churchill is and you know who he becomes. And how much do you, or how do you decide how much to tell of his future career? Or in the case of Teddy Roosevelt, we're looking at an adventure that's sort of after his important career. And how do you decide how much to tell of his life as a president and as the things that came before that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it was a very interesting experience for me doing like you said with Roosevelt. It's after his active political career, so I have to decide how much of his early story and everything I need to blend in, and then the other is like what's coming after. And in many ways with Churchill it was easier because, you know, of course I'm going to talk about his childhood, of course I'm going to talk about all, you know, his struggles in school and all those things, because they all make him the man he is, this young man he is. And then what comes last, what comes much, much later, you know, 40 years later, goes in the epilogue. So it goes in the epilogue. And there'll be some foreshadowing and things, but with Roosevelt, you know, this is near the end of his life. And so, but again, all of those things led him, you know, developed his character, developed his decisions, led to the decisions that he made. And so there's just no easy way to do it. The hardest thing is deciding what to let go, not what to use, but what not to use, right? And that's so often the case, especially if you are writing about somebody who's really well known like that, and you find a story that not many people know, and you're like, nobody knows this, but does anybody care? And does it further the story? Is it, you know, you want to tell it anyway, simply because you know it, and you want to tell, like, okay, all you people who've written about Theodore Roosevelt, did you know this? But again, you're doing that for you, not for your readers. And so you have to, and what I did is I'd stick it in my notes, because I think, well, if anybody bothers, then they'll see this weird little story that I thought was interesting and I hadn't seen anywhere else. And so I'll just stick it in my notes. But you have to be kind of brutal about that. And it's hard sometimes, you know, but it's definitely deciding what not to use, and also how to use what you are using, and keeping it moving. And that is a process of structuring and outlining, but also just editing.
Great, thanks. You mentioned talking about Destiny of the Republic, that you wanted to get your readers to care about Garfield before he was assassinated in the chronology of your book. Mm-hmm. I think that is a challenge for all of us. How do we get the reader to care about our subject in a kind of personal way? And so I'll put that spin on that question, but I'll also put it in the words of somebody who wrote in a question. How do you create a compelling character out of a real person? So
yeah, well, so
whichever those
yeah.
strike your button.
I think again, it goes back to being really careful about your idea. So just to talk about choosing ideas again, I mean, there are many ideas that would make an interesting story. There are many ideas that might make a really great long magazine piece, long form magazine piece. There aren't that many that would make a good narrative nonfiction book. And because you have to have, you have to have this great central story, you have to have great characters, and as you mentioned, peripheral characters as well as central characters. You've got to be able to structure it somehow. Maybe it's chronologically or whatever you're going to do with it. Mostly you have to have a ton of primary source material. And you might think you have a lot, but do you really? Also, if you're interested in doing this kind of writing, you have to keep reminding yourself, it's a story, not a subject. A biography can be a subject, but a narrative nonfiction slice of life, it's a story. So you might say, there's this person, there's such a fascinating life. Okay, well, what's the story? What's the story? So you have to clearly define what the story is and make sure you have all those other elements before you commit to something, in my experience. So I mean, the challenge, so writing about someone like Garfield, I don't think is hard at all to make him compelling or make you care about him, because he was, as well as being brilliant, he was kind, and, you know, he hid a runaway slave, and he was instrumental in bringing about Black suffrage, and you just can tell from the letters and what people wrote about him, he was somebody, you know, we would all want to be present, we all care about, and this horrible tragedy happens to him. So it's pretty easy to make people care, or try to get people to care about him. It's a little harder, obviously, with somebody like Winston Churchill, for instance. Even though he's very famous and everybody's interested in him, oh, you know, he's so arrogant, and, you know, he just like gets on your last nerve sometimes. And I always say, like, if I had lived anywhere near Churchill, our lives would have been so different. Even if we lived at the same time, I would, or had been contemporaries, I would have wanted to know him. I don't know how much I would have liked him. You know, I think he would have, but he was fascinating and so funny. But there are times, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of people I've noticed would be like, I thought I really liked Churchill, but after reading your book, and I actually found him fascinating and funny, and I like the fact that he could laugh about himself. But again, it's making them real, because I think that, look, not even Garfield was not a perfect human being, and I'm far from a perfect human being. I've never met a perfect human being. So I think that that aspect is what we can connect to, you know, and that's where we can see ourselves in a person. So to me, another thing that I look for in a subject, I don't like to write about somebody when it's like everything's great, you know, and they're the top of the world and it's a triumph. I'd like to write about them when they're struggling, when they're searching for a foothold, when they are grieving or scared or desperate, because that, I think, is what reveals their true character. You know, Garfield called it the bed of the sea, where someone is completely exposed, because A, that's fascinating, but B, we see ourselves in it. We've all been there, you know, and the older I get, the more I realize, the more I feel like I connect to these people, even if our lives are completely different. You know, I've experienced fear and I've experienced tragedy in my life, and I've experienced these things, and even if it's in different circumstances, I can connect to that emotion, and that way I can care about this character.
Yeah, very well said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else? You've talked about suspense. Are there any other techniques you have, tricks up your sleeve, to so-called keep the reader turning the page?
I think it's all about pacing and things. And I mentioned foreshadowing, and I remember, for instance, in The River of Doubt, there's this moment where one of the characters murders another character, and I sometimes it's really hard to get information about these characters, but I remember being so excited when I found, oh, earlier on, you know, he steals something, or early on there was some kind of confrontation and stuff. So I'm starting to plant those seeds where even if you're not really aware, you're like something, and all of us, it's like if you're walking down an alley and you kind of catch something out of the corner of your eye, you might not stop and stare, but you might kind of be like, huh, what, you know, I might want to keep, you know, that radar on. And so when you're reading, you're like, oh, that guy seems a little sketchy. I'm kind of afraid of him. I wonder if he's going to appear again. And then he comes back and he's still, and he's done something else. And so if, you know, obviously, again, it's nonfiction, it's got to be accurate, and you've got to be able to prove it all, right? But if you keep picking away, you know, we talked about, you know, one of the really fun things is if you are pulling on a line, okay, a line of research, a line of inquiry, and it's like a lot of times like, yeah, there's nothing there. But sometimes you keep pulling, you're like, oh my gosh, there's something, oh, this is really cool. I didn't even know this guy was going to be much of a character. There's just a scene, but you got him. That's again where the outlining really comes in. You're like, okay, I know all this stuff about this guy, so I'm going to start seeing. So I'm going to say, oh, this happened, and then you just move on. And oh, here's this guy again. Yeah. So that again, it's something that keeps the reader engaged. Like, what's that guy going to do? What's he up to? I'm nervous about him, and so you read on to see when he comes up again and what he does.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's more like fiction, because in many biographies, comprehensive biographies, we come across minor characters all the time, and they're just there because they're there, and not necessarily because they're going to play an important role in the story. So
right, and sometimes they're not. But if you can make that happen, I mean, I love that in fiction, where you think. I was just talking to my daughter about that, where if like Harry Potter or something, you're reading and you think, oh, that's just kind of interesting or fun little fact, and then later on it becomes important. You're like, oh my gosh, oh yeah, I remember, and now that actually matters this far down, you know. But that has to be seeded.
Yeah, great, thanks. What are some of the important lessons that you learned while writing River of Doubt, your first biography? And did you learn them from other writers or from your editor? Or if you could just tell us about the process of going through it your first time, because BIO has Well, we have biographers of all levels of experience, but quite a few people joined to learn how to write that first biography. So what were some of your best lessons then?
Yeah, it was a huge, huge learning experience for me. Well, first of all, I was terrified and I didn't know if I could do it. And just that alone, just having, once you've done one, I mean, at every book that I've written, I'm almost finished writing my fourth. At some point, and sometimes several points, I think this is a disaster. This is a terrible idea. It doesn't work. Oh my God, I've spent years of my life. What am I doing? You know, it just doesn't work. And but now that I've done it before, I'm like, okay, you knew this moment was going to come. Just stick with it. You know, you spent the time choosing the thing. You were just keep going. You'll be okay. Who knows what'll happen, but it's going to be okay. It's not a disaster, at least. So that was a main lesson, that just doing that first one is so helpful. You're like, I can do it. Also, you know, my kids and I always laugh about my husband. When he was much younger, he worked for UPS, and there was a driver, and then he would deliver the packages, and he would always tell us how he would look at the beginning of the day, and there's this huge truck and it's full of packages, and he would say to the driver, there's just no way, we can't deliver all these packages. And the driver would say, Mark, never look at the whole truck, just hand me the next package. and so that, you know, I tell my kids, you know, if you're writing a big research paper, you're saying never look at the whole truck, just hand me the next one. So when you're writing a biography or any kind of book, you know, people always say, I could never write a book, it's so long, I couldn't do it. It's like, never look at the whole truck, right? So just take the next step, take the next step, take the next step, and slowly, bit by bit, it'll start to come together. So, and then, you know, I keep harping on outlining, but I knew when I started writing River of Doubt that I needed a good outline. And I thought I had a good outline. I spent a lot of time on it, but it wasn't good enough, frankly. I mean, I started writing and I just was totally, again, lost. I've got tons of material. I thought I knew what I was doing, but it's, you know, it's not just, okay, this happens, this happens, this happens. It's again, layering in all these things. And, you know, when you're doing research, I'll make a little list. If sometimes I don't know where something's going to go, it's a great story or it's a great example of this person's personality, I have no idea how I'm going to use it. I'll make a list of things. Don't forget to use this, because some things are so great, you know, they're really, really great, and you can forget to use it. So it's just figuring out how you're going to layer in all these things. It gets complicated and it gets frustrating, and you just got to stick with it and just know that, you know, the fun part's coming up. And the fun part is, to me, I love editing. I love, once it's, you know, you've killed yourself, you've gotten it down, and it's really ugly for me. Many times I think, I hope to God nobody sees this because it's horrible. But slowly you wrestle with it, wrestle, and it starts to become something you're like, that's not too bad, you know, okay, I might read that, you know. So it's just a process, and you've got to just keep reassuring yourself and just keep chipping away at it. Also, one other thing, and I'm sorry if I'm talking too long, but one other thing we always talk about is we have this really good friend here who's a painter. He's just an extraordinary painter, and he's now 94 years old. And every day he goes out and he paints, and a lot of times he's outside painting. And he said to us one day, we were like, don't you sometimes just like not feel like painting? He literally paints every single day. And he said, I do. He said, sometimes I'll go into the studio and I don't feel great, or I just don't feel inspired. But I just tell myself, just pick up the brushes. And that's so true of anything. It's certainly true of writing. Just ideas come through the work. You know, writing is as much thinking as it is actually writing, but sometimes the gears won't start moving until you just start working. Just start writing, put something down, and you'll at least say, no, it's not that. So, you know, I'll start moving things around, but just pick up the brushes and start working.
Great advice. I see some buzz in the chat about your next book. Do you want to give us a little preview about it?
Sure. Yeah. I would love to. The book is about the search for the source of the Nile, and it's predominantly about these three men, Richard Burton, John Hanning Speke, and Sidi Mubarak Bombay. So Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke are British explorers, but very, very different people. So, and it's a story that I first heard, speaking of coming up with ideas, I first heard many years ago when I worked at National Geographic, and has always stayed with me because there are these two men who look completely different, have completely different backgrounds, and are thrown into this situation, and it's this friendship, and it's a betrayal of their friendship. So Richard Burton, many of you I'm sure have heard of him. He was just this incredible, brilliant linguist. He spoke like 29 different languages, another 15 dialects. He was one of the first people to enter Mecca disguised as an Arab because his Arabic, self-taught, was so flawless. And he was obsessed with finding the source of the Nile, which was the holy grail of exploration at that time. So the Royal Geographical Society sends him to Africa to do that. While he's there, one of the men he was supposed to travel with dies before he can even come. Meanwhile, John Hanning Speke, who is he's a soldier with the British Army in India. He's on leave. He loves to hunt. He's just a big hunter, and he comes from an aristocratic background. And Burton's a complete outsider. He grew up living all around Europe, learning all of these languages, and he doesn't look British, and Speke looks very British. He's very blonde and pale and thin and blue-eyed, and of everything the Royal Geographical Society would want. He goes to Africa, he meets Burton, and talks Burton into letting him come along on this expedition. And this just like, anyway, my kids are always like, why do you write about such gruesome things? So a lot of horrible, horrible things happen to them along the way, which is fascinating to me. But in the end, it's Speke who ends up finding Nyanza, which he names Lake Victoria. So again, it's the story, and it all leads up to this unbelievable tragedy, shocking tragedy. And then the third person is this guy, Sidi Mubarak Bombay, who was he was kidnapped as a child and taken from Africa to India, and where he was enslaved. And when the man who owned him died, he made his way back to Africa, where he met Burton and Speke, and he became their guide, and became very close to both of the men, especially Speke. And they, fortunately for me, wrote about him a lot and talked to him and learned a lot about his background. But then Speke ends up coming back with Grant, and he's also, Bombay again is their guide. And then Bombay was Henry Morton Stanley's guide when he found David Livingstone, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. That was Sidi Mubarak Bombay. And then he also was the first guy to cross all of Africa from east to west. So he is, without question, the most accomplished guide in the history of African exploration, and just an extraordinary human being as well. And so it's been really fun to research and write about him too.
Great.
And I was very lucky. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Do you have a title yet?
I don't. No, I've got some ideas, but just as an aside, I was really lucky because a couple of years ago, I'd already done my research in the UK, mostly in and around London and in Scotland. But I had been planning to go to Africa for years. And it just so happened that I was finally able to, a year ago, February, at the end of February, I left. I went, I was in Kenya, I was in Zanzibar, mainland Tanzania, and then Uganda. And I got back March 8th. So I was, when I left, it was like, everything's fine. And then by the time I'm headed back, I'm like, I hope I can get back. I hope they let me back into the country. It was like everything had just dissolved, it was just, so thank goodness I got it all done.
Yeah.
I don't know when I can go to Africa again.
That's great. Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions that I received in advance from BIO members. And this first one is a little long, but I'm going to read all of it because it's a question I have too. The level of detail in the events you depict are so engaging and have an almost cinematic quality. How do you handle events where such a level of detail or the precise actions of an individual during an event are not recorded? Is it ever okay in a historical biography to employ literary license to flesh out the scene so long as it is authentic and reasonably extrapolated from known facts?
For me, it's not. It's never okay. Again, I think it's my background at National Geographic, where we had this amazing, in fact, I started out as a researcher, and it's a back-end researcher, like a fact checker in the TV division at National Geographic. And then as a writer and editor for the magazine, I mean, absolutely not okay. And so if I don't know it, I don't say it. But I go to great lengths to find out. For instance, I remember my editor asking me for Destiny of the Republic, it starts with the scene where the assassin Guteau is on this steamship in the middle of the night, and he happens to be right on the ship when it collides with, right on the deck when it collides with another ship. And he talks about it's dark and he can see his pale hands, and my editor said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, I'll tell you exactly how I know it, because he talks about it at his trial. You know, he thought that that's the moment. It's many people died in that crash, and he survived, and he believed that he had survived. God had saved him for a great purpose, and then he came to believe that it was killing the president was that purpose." And so I absolutely knew it. And so that's why in my books I have so many notes, because I love when people say it reads like a novel, you know, but I want them to know that it's not a novel at all. It's completely factual. And that's why I have long detailed notes. And I was saying, people complain sometimes if they're reading one of my books on Kindle and they're like, "I thought I still had 20% left, and I found they're just notes," you know, they're long. But I know that some narrative nonfiction writers will just have like a paragraph kind of generally describing what sources they use for each chapter, and that's fine. But to me, it's really important to, you can see, like, how do you know they had cobblestone streets, or how did you know, again, like with Guteau, how can you possibly know that's what he was thinking? Well, because he said that's what he was thinking. And you know, if you go to the notes, you can see for yourself where I got it. So again, it goes back to as painful as it is, and I do know I've been there many times, where you think, "Oh, finally, I've been searching, I've got this great idea." Unless you are just drowning in primary source material, letters. I mean, for Garfield, I had so many articles. It took me a month just to go through the New York Times reporting on this one, on his shooting. And you know, journals and everything. Unless you are just drowning in it, if this is the kind of writing you want to do, I would just, you know, break your heart and move on to the next one, because you have to have a ton of primary source material in order to make that come alive. And I always say, in the books that I read, also one other thing that I for me, it's really important to not put myself ever in the story, because the books I read, I just want to lose myself in a story. I want to forget where I am and what I'm doing and who I am. I'm just completely engrossed, and I hate it when I'm reading a book and it's, I'm totally involved in the story, and all of a sudden someone will say, "And then, you know, when I went to this house last year, I found that," because you're like, it's like somebody grabbed you by the and just ripped you out of the story, right? You're like, fine. First of all, I assume that you did your research. Secondly, put it in the notes. That's fine. But don't destroy the story. You know, let this person immerse himself in the story. But in order to do that, you've got to have the primary source material to work with. Can't make it up.
And I assume that's part of the reason you pick subjects where there's lots of primary source material, presidents and prime ministers.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's obviously, it's a lot harder if it's somebody who's little known, you know, because not only, I mean, maybe they wrote their memoirs, or maybe they wrote a lot of letters and stuff, but you need other people writing about them, you know, to really understand who they are and what's going on. And yeah, exactly, having all that you need it to be rich, rich, rich with source material.
Okay, two questions. What, and these are coming from bio members. What do you do when you come up against a blank, when you need the information and it's just not there?
Well, I mean, it really depends on the situation. I mean, it, you know, either you work around it, you don't. I mean, if it's central to your story, then you probably chose the wrong subject. You know, I mean, you should have. Again, a lot of the research I do goes before I send in the proposal. You know, I mean, by the time I'm sending in a proposal, I've done a lot of research, and I at least know it's there. Whether I've accessed it yet, I know that it exists. So, and if it's, you know, just, you know, one scene, then you just write around it or you skip it. I mean, there are a lot of ways, and the you know, again, this is something with, you know, I'm getting old, but at least I have some experience, right? At least I can say, okay, I have some tools that I can work with it. And you know, you can't always understand, like, so many times I will think, I wish I could skip forward to a couple of days from now so I could see how I end up fixing this. Because right now I have no idea how I'm going to make this work. I wonder how it'll be, right? But you just know, again, ideas come through the work. So I picture it as wrestling. You're wrestling and wrestling with it, and you just find a way to make it work. But what you can't do is make things up. You can't, you know, leave a hole in, obviously, any kind of hole in it. You've got to be resourceful. You've got to be creative in the sense of not making things up, but like understanding, okay, how can I, and sometimes it's even just like a sentence, like how am I going to address this? How do I do this? And it's just thinking, I mean, I can easily spend a day on a sentence, and I'll go back and forth to it, be like, okay, it's going to be something like this, but that's not it, you know, and I'll figure it out. Or even a word. I know we've all been there where it's like, this isn't the word. I don't know exactly what exactly word I need here, but this isn't it. But I'll put a placeholder and I'll go back to it. And if your mind just keeps working, and it'll figure it out eventually. But it's just, you know, sweat and tears.
Okay, so what happens when you come across discrepancies in the record? And one person says, you know, so-and-so was present at the scene, and another source says that person wasn't present, or other kinds of discrepancies. How do you handle that?
Well, a lot of times, like I said, that's why you want multiple sources. So if you got 3 people who say he was there and one person wasn't, so you can go with that one person. In the notes, again, you can say so-and-so says, but you're telling the story. And so you're, to the best of your knowledge, this is what you've got. And so you've got it, you do have to make decisions. And yeah, a lot of times there will be discrepancies, but and again, you can write that into the scene, like, you know, later on, so-and-so said, actually, he wasn't there. You know, you can make it work. Again, there are multiple ways of coming at it, but you've got to do it honestly. And sometimes it's just hard.
Yeah. So you just have to go with your best.
Yeah. But I mean, but it is really important to be honest about it, but find a way to make it work. And you can both be honest and keep the story going without shutting everything down and saying, you know, sometimes you'll see that where people will just stop and say, there's an argument about this, and that's fine to do, but it's difficult to do it in narrative nonfiction. I think it kind of belongs in the notes.
Yeah. Okay. What authors do you read for inspiration, or what authors did you read? I mean, either now or before you started writing, that really sort of showed you the way, or
when I was fairly young, my father introduced me to Barbara Tuchman, and I loved her books, and I just found them fascinating. And it was the type of, you know, again, sort of honest storytelling that really impressed me. Also, not long before I can't remember exactly when it came out, but about the time that I was starting to write River of Doubt, Nathaniel Philbrook came out with In the Heart of the Sea. And I loved that book. And to me, it's just like this vivid, stirring, suspenseful story, and it happened, and so I really loved that book. Obviously, Eric Larson is I love his work. Stacy Schiff, I really like her writing, and what is interesting to me about her writing is she has a very strong voice, that's a Stacy Schiff book. And it's very different from mine, because like I'll read her books, and like I was saying, I just naturally have shorter paragraphs, and I'll read her books and I'll think I would have cut that there, and there. Sometimes you'll have a really long paragraph, and I was like, that's interesting. And it works. I'm not at all. I'm just like, that's so interesting. I would have cut it so many times, but it works for her type of storytelling. And I love anyone who has just a very strong narrative voice. Laura Hillenbrand is just incredible, just the depth of her research. Yeah, I mean, I could go on and on. David McCullough, obviously, Jan Morris, love her work. Martin Gilbert, some of the more traditional biographers. I mean, yeah, I have a lot of heroes.
Okay, that's great. Okay, let's see, I thought I had one more. Oh, did you make a conscious decision ever to write slice of life biographies versus cradle to grave biographies?
I didn't, I was saying that I remember when I won the BIO award, and you guys told me it was for slice of life, and I thought, oh, that's a great term. That's exactly it. And I had never even heard that term or thought of it in that way. I just love stories. I love telling stories. I love reading stories. And I was just looking for a great story to tell. And I just happened to, oh my gosh, here's, the middle of the Amazon and murder and everything. And Theodore Roosevelt is there, of all people. And it's the same thing with Hero of the Empire. I think, to me at least, it's an incredible story. And then the fact that it happened to Winston Churchill, of all people, just, makes it better. So again, I just look for stories that I love. And again, it takes me 5 years working on this, and I never get bored. I never, ever get bored. I love coming to work. I love coming in here, closing the door, and just going to this place, going back in time. And again, I have kids still who are still living at home, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, it's 3 o'clock. I've got to go pick them up. And I have to just kind of tear myself out of what I'm doing. It's just so much fun for me, but it's all about finding something that you love. And that's another thing I think that it's really important for people not to worry about finding something that they think is going to be a big hit and everybody's going to read. Find something that you love, a story that you would love to read, and tell that story, and a story that you're not going to mind at all spending years of your life with, and it's going to be fun for you. That's the only way it works. It's got to be genuine.
Yeah, great. Sort of the flip side of the authors who may have inspired you. One person who wrote a question said that she had observed that since River of Doubt came out, there seemed to be more slice of life biographies coming out. Have you observed that? And if so, do you have favorites or people that you would recommend? You, but not you. In between your books.
Yeah, there are always new writers, and a lot of there's a new young writer I really enjoyed, Catherine Grace Katz. She wrote a book called Daughters of Yalta, and it's about all the daughters of Churchill and Stalin and Roosevelt who were at Yalta. And it's really well done, and it's very original, and so yeah, there are always people that I'm finding, and I'm, always looking for a new, just great book just to read and enjoy. So yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, there are lots of questions over here, and I haven't quite been able to keep up with all of the ones in the chat. There are a lot of them, and some of them are sort of too long for me to skim. Anne, are you here? Do you want to pick out some questions?
Did you talk?
Sure, I can do that. I'm sorry, I haven't really been. I'm trying to find ones that maybe she hasn't answered. So what about opening paragraphs? Did you talk about that one? So
No, we didn't.
how long does it take you before you write the opening paragraph, and how many times in your revision does it change?
Actually, the very first paragraph of the book. Again, I spend so much time with the outline that by the time I get ready to write that first scene, and obviously it's hugely important, right? So the most important, though, it's the beginning and the end, and probably the beginning would be even more important than the end. So you want to really pull people in. I mean, that's something we've all been taught since, middle school. And so I do spend a lot of time thinking about that. But so I always have a prologue, and then I have the first chapter, and they're both almost equally important. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of editing, and a lot of times I think I know what I'm going to do, and I start writing it and I realize it doesn't work. And again, it's those, you have to just, a lot of times it's so tempting to just say it's fine, it's fine, it'll work fine, and but you just have to tell yourself fine is not enough, and I will say I have the luxury of taking the time, and I know not everybody does, and that and I'm super grateful for that I can take 5 years to write a book, and not everybody can do that. But I will say also, sometimes people think, well, my contract says 1.5 years or 3 years, and I've got it, and my editor's going to hate me for saying this, but he would tell you I have been at least a year late on every single book. My first book, River of Doubt, I signed a contract that it would be done in 1.5 years. I mean, 1.5 years. There's just no, I mean, it's going to, the middle of the Amazon. They're just that alone, it took like 1 year just to plan that trip. So it was just, I didn't know. And he said, can you do it in 1.5 years? I'm like, sure. And so that's another thing that I learned from that first book. What are they going to say? You're just like, it's not done, and it's much more important to have it be good than have it be on time. That, I think, to me, I'm always reminded, because I am a rule follower. That's my personality, and I stress out all the time when I'm late. And the rest of life, like, you invite me to your house, I'm going to be on time. I'm not a late person, but I just have to keep reminding myself. And I would, for young writers, I would absolutely just tell yourself, it's way more important that it's good than that it's on time. So if you are tempted to say, I'm running late, this is fine. And it might be fine, but fine's not enough. And especially, you've already put so much time and thought and energy and hope into this. Give it the time that it needs. This isn't something you can rush. Many times I'll look at something and I'll think, it's good enough, but I tell myself, just keep working on it, keep working. You can make it better. You can make it sing. You can make, would you read this? If you pick this up at a bookstore, would you then take it to the counter? Or if you picked it at the library, would you check it out? It has to be something that makes you go, like, I was just at somebody's house, and I picked up a Carl Hyacin, book, and he writes, my kids love his young adult things. And I just started reading the first page, actually just the first paragraph. And I looked at my friend, I was like, can I borrow this? Because I already, like, what? oh my God, what's happening? I want to know, and I'm not even a mystery, right? But it was really good. And so I know he didn't just dash that off. It seems short. It seems like not something he labored over, and maybe he didn't, but it's always worth the time. It's always, if it's not exactly what you want, keep working on it.
Great advice. Somebody has asked that she assumes you don't have graduate training in history. How do you think that advantages and disadvantages you as a writer of history?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I have huge respect for historians. People have, their doctorates in history. I have a master's in English. I was an English major. I thought I was going to teach, and my plan was to go on and get a PhD in English, but I hated literary criticism. I thought it like sucked all the joy out of reading, and I just wanted to read. So anyway, so that's why I got away from it. And I always say that my real education for what I do happened at National Geographic. That's where I learned storytelling, and that's more importantly where I learned deep research. And that's where I learned how to reach out also to experts. And that's another resource for people. We think of, archival research, we think of secondary research, we think of going to a place. You have to always remember, like with River of Doubt, I mean, I interviewed a ton of scientists trying to understand the science of river formations, trying to how this tiny, fast moving river worked, all the animals, that were how can Theodore Roosevelt be in the richest ecosystem on earth and be starving to death? How does that happen? And so you have to go to the experts. And the great thing is that they will want to talk to you. I remember when I left National Geographic and I was working on this book, and I thought, it's one thing to call somebody up at, say, the American Museum of Natural History and say, this is Candice Millard with National Geographic. Will you talk to me? It's a very different thing to call and say, this is Candice Millard. Will you talk to me? I mean, they, who, why would I spend my, but amazingly, every single time, absolutely, they're thrilled that you want to get it right. And this is sometimes, like in River of Doubt, there's this little fish that men in particular are horrified by, the kangaroo, right? That can swim up every orifice. Well, there's a guy at Marine in Florida who wrote a book about the kangaroo. And I don't know how many people have read it, but I've read it. And I called him, and so it was like, I mean, I would be thrilled if I'd spent years studying something and somebody came to me and was like, I'm going to write about this. Will you give me more information? Will you and they do, they're incredibly generous with their time and their years of experience and knowledge. And that's another reason why I have these really long acknowledgements, because I have so many people to thank who have helped along the way. You've got to rely on the experts, and you've got to be honest about what you don't know. You're going into this with a little bit of knowledge. There are a lot of places where you could fall down, a lot of ways you could get things wrong, and you've got to ask the questions.
Yeah, good. Another question is, have you been approached about turning your books into movies?
Yes. So River of Doubt was optioned many years ago by this guy, Jonathan Turteltaub, who did like the treasure, whatever. Anyway, he does like these kind of action films and stuff. And then subsequently it was optioned by Spotlight, Anonymous Content, who did that movie Spotlight, which was so incredible. So we'll see. I've even seen scripts sometimes. I have a sister who's a screenwriter. I know nothing about that world, but I do understand that a lot of times, I mean, the great majority of times, nothing happens, and that's fine. But Destiny of the Republic has also been optioned fairly recently, and I'm kind of excited. It's a young screenwriter, and he has some really great ideas. And then both of them have been made into PBS specials, and Nothing with Here, the Empire. But the fun thing is, like this young man who optioned Destiny of the Republic, he'll, you know, check in with me every once in a while and be like, oh, I'm so sorry, I haven't. And I was like, you know what? It's totally fine. You know, that I'm so happy here in Kansas with my kids and my work. And, you know, anything that you tell me from this magical land of Hollywood is fun. You know, it's interesting, but it doesn't, either way, if it never happens, it's totally fine. If it happens to be kind of fun, but it doesn't, it's not really it doesn't change what my book is or what I'm doing. So we'll see.
Okay. I think that's good. And we still have a little more time, but I think that's a good place to thank you very much and give her a round of virtual applause. So thank you very much. Do you have anything you want to add, Candice?
I just wanted to say thank you again. I've just enjoyed this so much. Linda, you're wonderful at this. And Michael, you're so great. And I love bio, and I love thank you so much, all of you, for taking time out of your day to join us. I enjoyed it so much, and it's just a real honor for me to spend this time with you. Thank you.
Well, I enjoyed it very much too, and learned a lot, as I keep learning from reading your book. So
thank you so much.
You very much again. And I'm going to let Michael keep this running a little bit so everybody can read the chat if you haven't gotten to see that. So, but this will conclude our evening. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.